the panel discussion is, we call it industry expert insights about third-party risk. And we will have Sam and Gabriel join this panel. We will have Rick from RBC. Rick is the head of third-party risk, IT risk at RBC, Royal Bank of Canada. And we have Laila from Norton Fulbright. Laila is a partner at Norton Fulbright. And Dennis from Deloitte, Canada. Dennis is a senior manager, risk advisory services. All right, so my first question for our panel really is third-party risk. Depends on have you in that field or not. So you may or may not have a direct experience in that field. So usually whenever we come to some area you're not that familiar with, so we will ask the question, why that it is important, right? So my first question is, why is third-party risk so crucial to business? And more you hear people talk about some related terms as well, supply chain risk or the vendor risk or IT risk. So all related to this. So I like to ask, why third-party risk is so crucial to a business? Maybe we'll start from a lawyer.
So, well, you mentioned a lawyer's favorite term, risk. We're all about identifying it and then mitigating it. And so when we talk about third-party risk, we've got privacy legislation, we've got specific sectoral legislation, whether it's banking or in healthcare, that has obligations in regards to how companies protect the personal information or other data that they have. There's also reputational risk. There's huge fallout when a company faces a cyber breach. And then from my perspective, as practicing in this area, if I had to think about the last 10 breaches that I served as breach coach for, 5 out of the 10 involved third parties that were, that were the cause of the breach. And of those 5, it was their vendor. So we're talking about a fourth party vendor who was actually responsible for the breach. And so it's, it's sort of magnifying the issues and concerns with, cyber breach and the protection of personal information. And on the flip side, so there's a reason why companies want to outsource information. It's about delivering products and services faster. So I'm always concerned about, risk management, stifling the speed of getting the deal done. And so trying to balance that is, important to me and, helpful for our clients who sit both on the vendor side and the customer side.
All right, cool. So Laila, actually from a lawyer's perspective, so the recent 10 cases she helped with, half of them related to third-party risk. And in fact, not only third-party risk, but fourth party, fifth party, like what you mentioned there. So that's really important. Just from number-wise, that's really, we need to get attention. And all right, Dennis, from consulting perspective, what do you see, why this topic is so important?
Yes, so in general, third-party risk, or what I would say in general, like vendor risk management, if we want to cover like third, fourth, fifth, whatever degree we want to take it, is very important because everyone works together. Companies, just like humans, need each other in order to succeed, in order to grow, right? And because everyone is focused on their business, you need to rely on any other organizations in order to partner you with and provide you with something, right? Now, in the recent years, we have seen cybersecurity evolve, and such we have seen different threats coming through different vendors or partners, and maybe they are not able to, let's say, break your perimeter for whatever reason, but maybe they are able to break your partners, right? And that's potentially a way to get into your system. And we're seeing it now every single day. So that's why right now it's a very hot topic in general with the vendor risk management. I guess with a focus in this specific conversation with the cybersecurity or information technology point is like, how can you get assurance that all those other parties are protected as well as you are, right? Because if everyone is doing their part, then in theory, we are going to be protected. But if you have, 1 week or not up to par organization, then that's potentially going to bring everyone down.
Mm-hmm. So we're on the same boat. So
exactly.
If one bad player will kind of let the whole boat sink. All right, cool. And Gabriel, from your point of view, what do you see there?
Yeah, I mean, I have to absolutely agree with Dennis there. It's very much a sort of a shared responsibility concept. The number and nature of attacks, right? The dynamic improvement in the bad guys' technology. They're constantly looking for new sources, new techniques, new tactics that are going to get in. If you always say a dedicated and motivated attacker most likely will find a way in at some point. So it's a matter of not just protecting yourself as best you can, but making sure you have tools and resources to respond when a breach does occur. So to be able to do a proper investigation, to have that data and telemetry where you can do a proper, at least from the technology side, an investigation of how a breach or an attack occurred. All that's really, really important.
Wonderful. Technology also very important role there. All right, Sam, so back to you. What do you see from your part? Why third-party risk is so crucial to a business?
Yeah, and kind of adding to what everyone, what the other panelists have shared, and I'll try not to repeat what they've shared. Certainly, some of the areas I covered in my talk, kind of looking at it from a software and technology perspective, kind of the evolution of where we came from to where we are now, right? So another tidbit about me, prior to kind of moving into a client-facing roles, I used to be involved in software engineering, right? So we would build, 20 years ago, these monolithic programs that everything was done in-house. You send it over to security, QA, everyone does testing. It's all done inside the organization. Now you look at today, that everything's really changed, right? We're taking a very modular approach. It's all about agility. We're reusing of code, not just inside the organization, but a lot of times you're getting code packages from a variety of third parties who are also themselves getting, code packages from fourth and fifth parties, right? So it's really become embedded into the products that we build as a organization. Similarly, on the IT side, right? We're not building all the services ourselves anymore, right? You got cloud services, which is really top of mind for a lot of people, but there's also the shift to the microservice architecture, right? So more and more, right? All these third parties are coming in. It's not just the contractor that's coming in to work on a project. It's not the consulting firm that we're working with for some kind of strategy consulting. They're becoming an integral part of how we run and operate our business. So when something fails, when there's a data breach within the third party, as Laila talked about, right? She's got 5 out of 10, right? It doesn't just affect things on the peripheral of our business. It's affecting the core, and it's really grinding business to a halt. And that's why it's becoming so serious now and so top of mind.
Yeah. So from architecture-wise, the industry changed a lot, so which also impact this domain. Okay, Rick. I hand that question to you. Why your job is so important? Because your title is a third-party IT risk at RBC. So why your job is so important to the business?
Well, I'll take some cues from what Sam said, right? When we think about the industry as a whole, right? The reliance on third parties will continue to increase, right? The third parties provide competitive advantages to your organization. They bring in specialized skill sets that if you didn't have a third party, you'd have to stand up, internally, and they may not necessarily be spread across the organization. It's sort of for a specific initiative, et cetera. So with the reliance on third parties, significant movement to the cloud, especially, there's tons of risk that third parties bring to your organization, right? If you think about an organization, the data that we have, it's behind layers of a firewall. There are access controls. We have, perimeter monitoring. We're doing testing and et cetera, et cetera. I can go on and on. With the introduction of a third party providing a service and or a solution to you, your data is leaving your organization. So there's an inherent additional risk to your organization that needs to be appropriately quantified and more effectively assessed, and then ultimately monitored across the supplier lifecycle.
Very true. Yes. All right, so thank you very much, everybody. So basically, we know from your perspective why this is a very important topic and why we need to put the topic for tonight as well. All right, so let's move on to the second question. So we answered the question why this is so important. Then we come to the what questions. As a third party, as a part of kind of like a risk management, right? Third party risk management. So it's a big topic. How do you break it down into kind of a major components? Just from knowledge perspective or educational perspective, how do you break down this a big piece into some like a domains or components? So what are some major components in a third-party risk management we need to consider? With that question, actually, I want to start with Dennis first. Yeah.
So generally speaking, it will cover basically, as Rick was saying, your entire life cycle of your suppliers, right? But here again, we are talking about, let's say, from a cybersecurity point of view, right? We are talking, let's say, for example, whether your suppliers have a incident risk management preparedness, where they are providing training, whether they are providing, access controls, and all those topics that we will look itself within our organization. At the same time, we are looking at all other risk areas that they should have in place in order to make you give you some sort of assurance as a buyer, if you may, or as the partner is engaging them, that they can actually provide that service and grow with you within the timelines, right?
All right, cool. That's a very important part. And okay, Rick, what do you see as the whole program? How do you kind of break it down to major elements?
Yeah, I think you need to effectively start looking at what your supplier life cycle looks like, right? So when we talk about components of a risk management program, it starts from the beginning, right? So you're assessing risk at the point where you're going through an RFP process. So there's layers of assessments there. And then your assessment questionnaires are broken down by separate centers of governance. So I may be focused on IT, my colleagues are focused on, what is our privacy risks, right? Is this data going to be outside of, the originating country? We have business resiliency risk. We've got financial viability risk. So there are many components that factor into the risk assessment process of your program. And that carries through to even contract termination, right? So as you continue to manage your supplier, you've determined which supplier you want to move forward, and that's through your procurement process. You move over to now your onboarding process, and through your onboarding process, we've got the whole legal component of it, ensuring that you've got appropriate language within your contracts to protect your positioning and to protect your data and your customer base, et cetera. And then you move into now your assessment phase, right? So you've got a multitude of different assessments that, our teams are very focused on, just to really trying to understand overall risk exposure, understand control compliance, and ensure that, obviously we're tracking, where we've got, gaps with some of our suppliers. That should feed into your contract process, right? So if I've got significant gaps, I should be feeding that back in. So, again, looking at the overall cycle. Once you've assessed your vendor, right, you now move into sort of a monitoring phase, right? You're monitoring for significant change. You have a reassessment protocol, et cetera. When you now terminate your contract with the vendor, I think that's still an opportunity to manage a risk, right? So just because a contract's been terminated doesn't mean that that vendor no longer has your data. So there are, other components that need to be in place to ensure that throughout the life cycle, all the way through contract termination until your data has either been returned or destroyed as per retention policies, you need to have components in there that's assessing and managing your overall risk.
Mm-hmm. Very important perspective really is look at the whole life cycle of the third party, from beginning to middle, then engage, then even finish. After finish the engagement, how do you look at that?
Yeah.
Of course, for any topic, you can look from different angles. And when we say elements or components, all those things, sometimes interchangeable. But really, what we try to say is, how do you look at the whole things? Try to break it down to important areas, and hopefully you don't miss some really important parts. All right, so we hear from consultant, from the user side. I'd like to give a little bit legal stamp. So Laila, what do you think about how to make a third-party risk management program?
So when I think about what's important for management, I think when it comes to vendors, you want visibility. You want to ensure that the services are always reliable and safely delivered. And then to Rick's point about going through the entire life cycle of the vendor, I'll go one step further and also say that you want the ability to ensure that the services can be ported from one vendor to another seamlessly if you have to change. And so I will speak about one aspect of the risk, risk governance model, which is, essentially governance and risk mitigation, because that features heavily in contracting. And, when I'm negotiating a contract, I will liaise with the client's, IT teams, their security teams, to ensure that, they're comfortable with the vendor's profile, whether we need extra protections in the agreement itself. Because the last thing that we want to do is scare off a vendor. And there have been occasions where, on the flip side, working with a vendor, you find that a vendor is, a little trigger shy about signing the contract when they're, faced with a very long data questionnaire and then an agreement that has uncapped liability, which means that, if something goes wrong, they're on the hook for, they'd have to write a check for any amount. And so from that perspective, I think governance and risk mitigation is a very important element. But it's an element that shouldn't just be shared by your legal team.
Very true. Yeah, so the whole process, there's a multiple expertise need to participate this process. Not just risk technology, but legal advice, and to make sure everything right from the beginning. And before you start engagement, there's a lot of things need to be considered as well. All right. Considering time, I actually want to move to the next question. The next question really is related to we have a recent, because why third-party risk all of a sudden become a hot topic. Not only we know this is important, but also recently there are quite many incidents related to that. So for example, the recent one, the incidents we all know, SolarWinds. So what are some lessons learned from the recent supply chain security breaches? So with that question, I actually want to ask two from solution providers point of view. Gabriel, you first, and then Sam, you second, to kind of give us some thoughts about what kind of lesson learned from there.
Yeah, it's a hard one to give a full answer right now, because there's actually still investigation and new information in that attack coming out, right? It's not a complete picture even now. Some of the points that stand out with that for me are things like the amount of dwell time and the access that the attackers had into the SolarWinds environment before they even deployed the compromised software, right? They got access into the SolarWinds environment, I think it was September 2019, and the software patch was deployed in March 2020. So there was a full 6 months of dwell time where the attackers had access into the environment. Potentially, that's the whole reconnaissance time and potentially lateral movement and the different activities that can be going on there. So really it's, I don't know, the lesson I'd say is visibility into your environment, kind of a holistic view of the different pieces of your environment. And then some really simple security hygiene pieces, two-factor authentication. There was talk early on about a compromised account that was used to access the FTP site, things like that. There are some really simple things that sometimes get overlooked. So be thorough in your security design and your security policies, and ensure you're checking back and enforcing and making sure that compliance is happening with those policies, just to make sure that some of these potential gaps don't rear up and bite you later.
All right, cool. Sam, what do you say about that?
It's an interesting problem. A couple of observations, and these are my personal opinions and observations. Related to the recent SolarWinds breach. Right. I think one is that most customers are not prepared, and that's not to say that they haven't done their due diligence or done their own risk assessments and all of that. Really, it's more on the incident response planning, right, and the risk mitigation or the recovery time and plans that they have in place. It is a very complicated problem. It's one that's really hard to detect, and I think that's another area where, if anything, I think it's a validation of what many of us in the industry have been talking about and sharing with customers, is that the new perimeter is around the identity. It's no longer the network perimeter. It's no longer that traditional perimeter that we see. Because even though the malware, the package came in through the supply chain, ultimately it evolved and turned into an identity-based attack, right? When it goes through reconnaissance, when it goes through the account takeover in that scenario. And so, a couple of things that I think will definitely help a lot of organizations potentially, and some of this we learn ourselves at Microsoft. And one is adopting that zero trust mindset and framework in all of your services and all your assets, right? So minimizing that blast radius. I think the other one area is leveraging a lot of that behavioral analytics, right, and the behavioral patterns of machine learning across the security stack, right? Being able to detect anomalous activity without having to wait for your SOC team to look over the logs and try to find this, because these things are happening real time, really quickly. The other on the other side of this is having the data exfiltration detection, right, and policies in place, so that when these bad actors finally get their hands on what they need and they try to take that out of the organization, you have a way to not only detect and monitor for it, but also prevent that from happening. And this is where it starts getting into interesting newer areas like insider and internal risk management, which, when you think about it, Bryan, it's an interesting scenario, because here in this case we're not talking about an actual insider, somebody who's part of the organization doing something malicious, but from the when you follow the timelines of the attack, really ultimately that's what's happened, right? You got somebody outside who came in, impersonated somebody who's inside, and then from that point onward, it's really meeting or fitting that pattern of an insider risk attack, right? So that's why some of those tools may be able to help and address some of these scenarios. So it's actually very interesting. So I think a couple of different areas. Certainly, behavioral analytics could definitely help, adopting that zero trust, and then having your data exfiltration policies and technologies in place as part of your security stack.
Mm-hmm. What I can also hear from is there's the layers of defense, right? So if there's something you cannot capture in the first place, hopefully the next layer can capture that one as well, and also leverage some technologies. All right, cool. Let's move on, because I actually very like one of the Rick mentioned that one, the whole life cycle. So I like to throw a kind of like a scenario here. So let's say I'm in the organization. So I want to implement, I'm new to that organization, and I got a assignment, or actually not assignment, it's actually the big job from my boss to say, okay, now you need to implement a third-party risk management. And you need to implement the whole risk assessment process for the external parties. Well, I may have quite many big or small third parties. What should I do? I have 5 experts here, right? So I really want to hear that. And back to Rick's point, the whole life cycle, the process. So what should I do before the assessment, before I even have that vendor or the suppliers come to sign that contract with us, right? So what should we need to pay attention to? Then the next question will be during that assessment, when we are conducting the assessment, what should I pay attention to? Then the third question will be related to after we finish the assessment, because we all know that's a lot of times it's a questionnaire or checklist, how that's useful for my overall. And And Rick also mentioned, after we finish the contract, what should we do? So that's a life cycle. So let's focus on before assessment first. And I like to ask, because usually consulting firm will provide a lot of insights on that. But Dennis, what do you say before assessment?
Yeah, so it's even before assessment, definitely the main question, at least for example, that I ask to my clients is like, okay, if they don't have a program, let's try to put something together. Let's say quickly, in order to ideally first identify what are your main vendors, right? And this could come with a different set of criteria, and that's its own topic. But first of all, identify what are those main vendors, and then try to see what are the tools readily available that can give you an idea from them. Like in some cases, yes, these vendors may already giving you some sort of information, you name it, from a SOC 2 report or CAIQ available, like whatever it could be. But then taking it to the next step is like, is that enough? Does that answer your question? Do you have a really good idea on what's the risk that a specific vendor for the service they provide to you? Is it enough for you to feel comfortable to tell your stakeholders, yes, I believe this vendor is doing okay or is doing great, right? So that's taking it to the next level of the life cycle. So definitely what I will say at first, even before all the assessments, is like, identify what is your main vendor for the specific area that you are trying to cover, whether it's cyber, whether it's operational, whether it's other type of risk, and then take it to that specific next step.
Excellent, very good. So you need to understand who you are dealing with first. And all right, Rick, what do you say about that? You're dealing so many vendors.
Well, I agree. I agree to a great extent in terms of what was just mentioned. I think just to add to that, right? I think you need to first understand what you're trying to solve for, right? Number one, you need to understand what type of data will be in play as part of that engagement. You need to understand, is that data going to be hosted externally? And if it's hosted externally, is that in a cloud environment? So going back to what was said, you need to understand your risk earlier on in the process, so that you can then choose the appropriate next steps in terms of the breadth and depth of your information. To add a little bit more context to that, you know, if we're thinking about, I'll just take the RFP process, right? You haven't decided on a vendor, you've identified 5 vendors that operate in a specific space. I think best practice is not only understanding your overall risk exposure, but doing a preliminary assessment, right? So if you can preliminary assess those vendors, and I'll just take an extreme example. You know, this engagement has, you know, restricted data or very sensitive data at play that's going to be hosted externally. I already know from an IT risk and cyber risk background, we're going to throw the book at this vendor in terms of the required security controls they need to comply with. So I can start asking some of those questions earlier on. And by doing so, it's going to educate the business in terms of, out of the 5 vendors, which of those 5 can actually meet my requirements, right? So you start understanding that earlier in the process before you assess the vendor. We're leveraging that data to help the business make informed decisions on the vendor we want to move forward with, right? So again, it would make no sense to move forward with a vendor that had the lowest compliance score when we're talking about very, very sensitive data. That will be a showstopper to us when we get to the contract negotiation process.
Excellent. So you bring a very important part is really about the data. So from data point of view, that's the sensitivity, confidentiality, all those things, right, related to data, how critical that one. So you kind of do the pre-assessment first and to sort out the bad fruit at the beginning or reduce the risk at the beginning. Laila, because before the assessment, engagement, they're also related to contract, right? So because you need to work with vendors to negotiate contract, what's included, what's not included, all those things, that drive a lot for the future process. So can you provide us some insight on that one?
Completed, but I will ask questions to Rick's point about what type of data the vendor will have access to, how they will access our systems, whether the vendor would be providing any customized code, what their code building practices are. whether they will be using open source, and whether they have an open source compliance. So there are a number of pre-check questions that I would ask to kind of suss out the vendor's risk profile, and then feed that into the contractual terms. It also is helpful to understand just how the vendor did in the initial assessment, whether this vendor scored well, or whether there needs to be additional protection in the contract to account for this as well.
Okay, so those are pre-assessment important related to the future risk. And are there any specific, from contract point of view, any specific areas you need to pay attention to? Maybe term and conditions or whatever coverage things from legal area.
So I think from a basic perspective, understanding the quantum of risk. So if this is a fairly risky project, whether we want to paper it by having broad indemnification, limitation of liability, ensuring that the vendor is actually able to commit to that type of indemnification by requiring them to have insurance. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, just how the company intends to monitor and get visibility on this vendor. So, it starts up initially as, at a minimum, having the right to audit their systems. Then there are also obligations for them to ensure that they provide you with information about any third-party audits they themselves do, to maintain certain certifications as an obligation under the contract. If they are the, obviously, if they've been the subject of a data breach, if they've had potential breaches of their systems, you will want to have that information, readily available and shared with you as well. So, it spans the gamut from the obvious, which is, risk mitigation via contractual terms to ensure that there's coverage for liability. But then there's also terms to ensure that you have sufficient information and sufficient visibility on their systems to monitor their compliance with both the regulation and contractual obligations.
All right, visibility and also understand the obligation in the early stage. Very good. All right, let's move on for let's say we start the engagement. So we usually kind of send a questionnaire or checklist or ask a vendor fill in or jump into my GRC system to fill in all those assessment. So what kind of things we need to pay attention to? Gabriel, so what's your view on that one?
I think a lot of that, again, I'm coming from the sort of that tactical cyber technical view. The overall kind of completeness of their systems, making sure that they have mitigating controls over a number of all the different range of potential cybersecurity vulnerabilities and issues in systems that might be impactful for leading to a potential breach of data, right? Make sure you're confirming the systems and confirming the protective layers that they have implemented and deployed on those, so that you can have that level of comfort of them being in possession of your data. So yeah, I think really being thorough about the different potential vectors where access might be available to the data they have possession of, the interactivity that might be there, and the mitigating factors that can be applied to protect against that.
Okay, access management to the important data.
Mm-hmm.
Right, very cool. Sam, what do you view like a data collection or kind of assessment of things during that process?
Yeah, no, great question. And I think definitely, my fellow panelists are probably more experienced in terms of leading customers through this framework. So maybe I'll kind of take the questions from the perspective of a vendor being involved, a technology partner being involved in a lot of these processes. I would say, some observations kind of over the years and working with a lot of my customers is, one, understand the set of services that that third party can or may provide to your organization, right? I've seen this actually change in behavior over the years, which is really good to see. You know, it would start off with, hey, we just want this one service out of your platform, and that's where we do the PRAs and the TRIs and do all the questionnaires around. And then 2 weeks later, I get, you know, a different questionnaire from the same customer, but from a different part of the organization, because now they're looking at a different service, right? So as much as you can understand the set of services that this third party can provide you, and then go talk across your business, talk across all of your other stakeholders and leaders, and see who else may already be also considering that vendor, what services are they looking for, and then, you know, where possible, consolidate and reuse a lot of that data or the set of questions you're gonna ask them, because anytime you're going back and forth, that's time lost, that's time wasted, and you know, so, you know, again, I'm seeing more of that now, because obviously, you know, in some of the RFPs and the questionnaires I get, I would all of a sudden get an entire page and, like, you know, 100 to 200 questions that have nothing to do with what we're talking about, and I'm going to other parts of my organization to try to get those answers, and clearly ensuring that, hey, customers are also seeing this and they're getting smarter about this. So that would be one observation is, you know, understand the full set of services. Think about what you may use today, but also what you may use tomorrow, and also across your other business units, and then where possible, reuse the data that you get back, and minimize that going back and forth, right?
Okay, great.
Sorry, something that I would add just to what Sam just mentioned is like, actually some vendors are being smart right now, because they say, like, we already came last month and asked me this. You already used your right to audit. You have only one right to audit a year. See you until next year, right? So it's very important, just to what Sam just mentioned, like, you as an organization, make sure that you gather the information, what you want to ask from your vendors, try to consolidate it, create a plan, create a schedule, and then go together to get the right answers that you need.
Mm-hmm.
And that right to audit is an interesting piece, because Laila brought it up in the last question as well, right? I think that's an area with some of these details. Also talk to your peers in the industry or vertical that you're in, right? An example of this that I've been involved in is OSFI regulation within the Canadian financial services. So, you know, when I was telling a customer about BPOS or Office 365, the right to audit came up all the time, right? And it was a constant, hey, we can't do it. Just the sheer number of customers we have, the location of data centers. And instead, what they did was they talked to their peers, and like the banks talked to each other, and then we talked to them when we brought in and worked with the regulators. So instead of providing right to audit to every customer, we said, hey, we're going to give the right to audit for the regulators. And that helped to satisfy, you know, everybody, and it's a win-win situation in that stance. So, you know, also, you know, think about talking to your peers in the industry that you're in, especially if you're in a highly regulated vertical.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we got this assessment result back, right? So vendor looks like done their initial job. So what now all the data we collect or we ask them is already on our table in front of us. So what should we do? Is that our job done? So post-assessment, how do we kind of continue monitor or assess or like to evaluate them? So what kind of insights do you have? Rick, what do you say about this question?
So I was going to jump into the previous question, but let me answer this first, because I do want to just add a couple of points to, you know, during the assessment process. But, you know, post an assessment, I think you need to ensure that you have now understood your risk exposure. So what are the control gaps? What are the control deficiencies? You should then be working with your vendor to ensure that you've got appropriate remediation plans in place, where remediation plans can be implemented, and or that the business is educated on the risks that they may be potentially accepting. So the output of an assessment results in findings that should be tracked in your IT risk register, in your issue management tool, whatever they may be. So you need to be tracking that and managing that diligently, and that's an activity of a post-contract review. A post-assessment review. In addition to post-assessment, your vendor now moves to the next stage in your life cycle, and that's continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring has various components. One would be, you know, a periodic reassessment. So, you know, whether that's an annual reassessment every 2 years, et cetera, that should be determined based on your overall inherent risk and risk exposure. In addition to that, your monitoring program needs to include caveats for significant change. So if there's a significant change with the engagement, as an example, your vendor was brought in to do application development. Now they're doing production support. There's a different level of risk that's introduced, as they may have now access to production data and access to production systems, and assessment would need to be kicked off. So that's all part of that. In addition to continuous monitoring, there's technology that's out there, right? I think, when I look through this chat, people have been asking about BidSide and security scorecard and a whole host, risk recon, a whole host of other tools that are out there, should be implemented within an organization, right? Because outside of a reassessment cycle, you kind of don't know what you don't know, right? And these tools provide visibility to drive specific action. So whether that's, a poor cybersecurity score, or there's negative news, there's a impact to financial viability. These are all components that should be part of your continuous monitoring program, as that vendor enters into that stage. To get back to the earlier question, what do you look for during an assessment? I just want to just call out the fact that during an assessment, you should be looking at everything, right? Your assessment should be aligned to your policies and standards. So you should have identified those important controls that you need to assess. So you're assessing against those controls, so you should be validating everything. A mature risk assessment model should consist of trust, but verify. And a very mature model can now also introduce, validate with a lot of the industry standard tools that are out there. So I think you need to be looking at everything. You need to have an understanding of risk exposure and also managing that risk exposure.
All right, very good. A lot of information you to digest. That's addressed the whole important process, and including the continuous monitoring, credit score, status update, all those important elements. All right. I'm also cautious about time. Right now is only 1 minute before we set up the whole session time. So if the panel are okay, and I like to extend for 5 minutes. Just want to finish 1 or 2 important questions. And for people online, understand you're already with us for 2 hours. We'll record a session. So once approved, we will publish that one. I hope you can still stay with us for another 5 to 10 minutes so to wrap up the whole session. All right, so my next question really is about the future. So we talk about a lot of current or previous problems, issues, or challenge or best practice. Where is this industry going, especially for third-party risk management? What do you see the future look like? Maybe I can ask Dennis first.
I gotta think quick about that answers. No, yes, I think the industry is going to continue moving ahead towards creating ideally specific frameworks that can be adapted and incorporated as fast as possible. However, let's be realistic. They may answer only 70% or maybe 80% of those questions without being specific to your environment, to your business. So there's still going to be some work, some due diligence, and that's a keyword that I've seen in the chat, that needs to be done by each organization in order to make sure that you get the answers that you need in order to satisfy what are those questions, or as Rick was mentioning, like, what are you trying to deal with? Right? Once you get those answers, then you will actually be complete and continue going through that cycle. So I think that's particularly where the industry will go, and ideally to create those specific frameworks and continue enhancing those specific reports to be the most adjustable as possible.
All right, the framework for the future. Laila, what do you see the future?
Well, I think a lot more companies are going to take third-party risk a lot more seriously. We're talking to an audience that is already well-versed in third-party risk. We have advised in this space that companies that don't have vast multitude of data, they don't have tons of customer data, or they may not have tons what they think is sensitive data. But what they do have is employee data, and they could have lots of it. And that, frankly, is a treasure trove. So companies that traditionally may not have considered third-party risk, in their risk bucket, are now starting to recognize that it's important. And so, while I understand the importance of having tools and monitoring systems and really rigorous standards for governance, I'm also working with companies who are smaller that don't have those resources and trying to tailor a governance structure for those companies so that they can, mitigate their risks from third-party risk.
Right. So not only the large organization need to take care of that, but the small businesses, startups also need to take care of that because they are using the third party as well. Rick, what do you see from the future?
Yeah, so I just to kind of expand on what Laila was saying, and I agree. I think when we think about this space, right, taking SolarWinds and a lot of the significant breaches that we've seen, in the past several years, I can tell you that third-party risk is a board level discussion, right? And as such, the funding now for ensuring that we've got appropriate controls in place, bringing in the right talent, ensuring we have the right processes. Is all top of mind for our executives. I tell you, in my job, I'm constantly providing updates to our senior leaders on the state of our third-party risk management program because they're extremely, extremely worried. In terms of where the industry is going, right? When I think about regulation, local, country-specific, region-specific, privacy, things that are coming up, the regulators are really, diligently looking at now third-party programs within organizations that they're assessing, right? So a number of us have gone through these in-depth reviews. So regulators are spending more and more time, trying to ensure that organizations are prepared, right? So they're not the next, organization over the news, and they are, looking deeply at, third-party risk programs, ensuring that there's appropriate oversight, governance, there's alignment to, risk appetite, et cetera. In terms of also where the organization's going, I'll go back to something that Sam said, right? And even Dennis kind of touched on as well, right? We are moving towards automation. We're trying to leverage, AI. How do we get smarter about, managing our questionnaires to our supplier base? We think about our organization resource pool, right? The answer is not, hey, when we have a inflow, we just hire more people, right? We're constantly being asked to do more with less, right? So we have to be creative in how we do that. And there are many vendors in the industry that are providing that capability. When I think about the consortiums like TrueSights that are out there where, we're looking at the now shared assessment space. So now I have a repository of assessments, let's take, a Microsoft, right? Thousands and thousands of customers and thousands of assessments they have to do on an annual basis. They're probably pulling their hair out, right? So, they're very focused on, how do we get certified? Take your SOC 2 Type 2 reports, using a SIG, leveraging, one of these consortiums so that they can answer these questions on an annual basis and be able to share that with their clients in a platform, right? So really trying to drive more and more efficiencies in automation in that space.
Automation is a key, and although technology need to work with a process, but technology does improve the productivity a lot. And Sam and Gabriel, what do you see? We need to be a little bit quicker right now. It's just one or two sentences. What do you see the future there?
Maybe I'll just jump right in, and I'll try to be brief, right? So. A couple of thoughts coming from a technology partner perspective. I think definitely the solutions and the tool sets, right? Looking at how we can get better at those centralized security risk scores, right? Today, a lot of that work is still done through what we call cloud analysts or security analysts, right? So we've got a team of over 3,000, right? So again, to Rick's point, we're not going to get more. We're going to get them to do more. So how do we get smarter? Again, how do we get that to be more efficient? The other piece is around continuous monitoring, right? So how do we tie that validation into the tools so that we're not waiting between audit cycles and more broadly across third parties, across different technologies, because a lot of our customers have heterogeneous environments. And now on the data side, it's about getting better data insight, again, across all those third-party repositories, whether it's on AWS, whether it's on Azure, whether it's on GCP, right? How do we get in there? How do we apply the same set of governance policies so that it's consistent across the board, right? Coming from the cyber side, that's where we get into the technical controls, right? Getting more and more customers adopting zero trust, moving to a world where things are passwordless, right? So reducing that attack vector. And then, back to Rick's point as well, is this, how do we further integrate AI and ML across all of these elements, right? Really reducing that time to detection and really enabling us, whether you're, a S500 enterprise to the mom and pop shop, to really have that self-heal capability when a breach happens, when an attack takes place, right? So that's kind of, the things I see on the technical front, on the technology front.
Excellent. Very cool. Gabriel, what's your insight?
Sam kind of stole some of my points there, so I'll agree. Definitely, it's
sorry, Gabriel.
it's all good. But yeah, from a technology viewpoint, it's really universal that things are moving towards automation. Making it easy, more of a iterative approach rather than kind of point in time assessments where you can potentially miss all the potential changes with the service or the technology or the capabilities. Having that more frequent check-in and adaptive sort of controls in there, I think is definitely where things are likely heading.
Excellent. The adaptivity is also very, very important. All right. I think considering the time, that's all for today's panel discussion. We learned a lot, and especially for the process-wise, I kind of get a lot of takeaways I need to digest. For sure, a lot of people online will also need to learn from there. And so our 5 panelists spend their time and share their expertise and experience. I like to ask everybody online to give them a virtual kind of a clap or a tap or other things. So thank you very much for our speakers to share their insights and knowledge with us. And also for people online, really thank you to join our event. Hopefully you get some value from there. Just to quickly share with you, so you hear the insights from our 5 speakers. Again, Sam from Microsoft, Gabriel from Trend Michael, Rick from RBC, Laila from Norton Fulbright, and Dennis from Deloitte.